Today I'm talking about experiencing Great War battlefields and about how commemoration is a ritual. And at first I'm going to talk about the kinds of things that people are actually doing outside the state commemorations. My comments are based on the work that I've done in France on the Somme and around Ypres in Belgium at different battlefields and sites like cemeteries, museums and visitor centres. So these are the main areas that the British fought. I've not dealt with school groups, and so the samples have mostly been people over the age of 40. Generally I've found quite a lower group of people in their 20s and 30s. Most people that I've spoken to have been British, as you would expect, but these areas are also visited by a lot of Belgian, Dutch and French people. So a ceremony or an act of commemoration is part of the process of creating and maintaining social memory through the stage of rehearsal. So that is, of recalling and remembering what those memories were. Social memory is a well-known process in which memory is renegotiated by each new generation within a society or a group. So time is not the factor in this, but it's the fact that generations differ in their characteristics. So social demographics are different, their technology is different, and so they have different needs from social memory. So first I'd like to talk about some of the commemorative practice that's going on outside the state commemorations, and there's quite a lot of this kind of thing. Many of the activities are small, informal or private, and they often have common elements. So laying flowers such as a wreath, poppies, a card, some other offering, and writing in the visitor books. These are the common things that people do. National flags are also quite common, but there's a range in the way that they are presented. So if you compare a formal state ceremony where they may be carried by military or former military personnel, compared with private ceremonies where they might be just a little postage stamp flag, they're still used extensively. Not all individual acts of remembrance appear to be rituals, which I'll talk more about later, but if they're considered from a broader social perspective, then the notion of ritual does apply to them. And this is because of the overall commonality of the features, such as the objects used and the regularity of the timing and the sites that are used. These acts are conducted by a wide range of groups in the battlefields. So a lot of families, but it may be also somebody who's researching a particular soldier. There are lots of remembrance associations. Some are military, some are all kinds of other historic and other interest groups, and also tour groups who visit these areas. The first thing I'll talk about is geography, and this is very important for commemorative work. And I find that people are always looking for places, the site at which events happened in the past. So maybe it was a battle or a site of death and injury. The memory of place names across generations is quite astounding, I've found. Sometimes people know an exact site. For others, a name might be all that they know about something that happened to one of their relatives, for example. It might be just Somme, but it can also be Broadside Ridge or Daisy Wood or Pozières. And a person may not be able to immediately recall a name, but if you say it to them, there's this instant recognition and they'll say, yes, that's it, that's the place. And they know it, they're very definite. And many people want to go there to experience that place. And I've come across people who have been walking in their footsteps, so walking a soldier's last few kilometres, maybe to where the trench was, and then laying something in the ground for them. And these people want to tell these stories, they want to tell his story, the story of that soldier, because it's important. So what they're doing is they are articulating a memory and then commemorating it, rehearsing it by an act that makes that place special. Also, many visitors comment that they didn't really understand the war until they went to the battlefields, and particularly the cemeteries. There's something happens during the visit, the transformational experiences that seem to be activated by being in the landscape. And this is a really common and important theme. Timing and dates for commemoration are also important, and this is for similar reasons as geography. Something important happened on that day, and the date of death is common. Sometimes I read in the visitor book where people will write something like, they write to the soldier and they say, sorry, we're a day late. So clearly some people visit at regular times each year for a soldier who's in that cemetery. There's also quite a bit of commemoration on behalf of other people, and I think this is a long tradition, people visiting graves on behalf of someone else who can't visit that place. This is evident in the visitor books, and I've done this myself, and I've seen other people, I know of other people doing it. And in the early years after the war, this provided evidence that these overseas graves existed. And as Bart Zeno found, the practice also is direct evidence that the grave is well cared for. So people will then conduct their own small cemetery ceremony at a grave, and they might take photos to show somebody at home. And they'll often bring something from home to put on the grave as well, like a poppy or a little wooden cross. Social memory of the Great War still tends to focus on those who were killed during the war, but of course they've all passed on now. And the men who survived often had a very difficult time for the rest of their lives, and Marina Larsson refers to them as being unsuccessfully killed, meaning that they too suffered, but they were forgotten. They were the memories that were set aside. So I think now we can see people visiting to remember those men and women who survived the war, and I think maybe this is a new area for research. It could give those men and their families some meaning for what they had to endure. Somebody said to me one day, where do I put these poppies for someone who survived? How can I remember him? So these men were all over the place. Which site do you pick to act as that special or sacred place? I'd like to say that an enormous amount of voluntary remembrance work is being done by French and Belgian citizens in the former war zones. And the Digger Coat Association in Pozières, for example, it's just a small village of 250 people. They run a big sound and light show every 2 years to remember the battles in their village. And other people in the village organise a number of events, smaller events. They hold their own remembrance ceremonies at the memorials. They host visiting groups and dignitaries. And another group I know organises a big walk from Ypres to the Somme every 2 years, I think, as an act of remembrance. So a little bit now on social memory and theory of it. It's important to remember that in the early days after the war, people were not forced or led into accepting these memories about how the men and the war should be remembered. And I found this continues to be the case for many people. I was once told quite clearly by some visitors that I was talking to that it was their decision to travel to the battlefields and lay a wreath for their relative, that no one had forced them. And they said it in the sense of, why would we not do this? Why would we not remember our relative? It's worth remembering that the impetus for the ceremonies after the Great War was to allow people to alleviate their grief, to show respect and to give thanks to the men and women who had been involved. This need is still very much evident, I think, And Ross Wilson argues that trauma from the Great War still exists in British society. Many visitors that I talked to on the Western Front had a relative who served, so a lot of great uncles, but also grandfathers, men that they had known. So the war is very personal for a lot of people. And this means that, to make a statement of the blatantly obvious, visiting battlefields is an emotional experience. People who had no family involved in the war also have very deep experiences because of what they know and because of their commitment to remembering these people and what they did. But we are now only finding out what a lot of the soldiers had actually done. So their families and other people too are often creating their own acts of remembrance, but they use common elements, and I think it's because these are known to be the appropriate and accepted ways to show respect and give remembrance. So remembrance ceremonies by their nature are commonly conducted as ritual. State ceremonies are by no means the only ones conducted on the battlefields, but they are often the largest, and perhaps sometimes they provide a focus for people who are visiting. So ritual has special features. Not all acts are ritual, but there's a wide range in the type of acts and how they are conducted that can be considered as ritual. So one of the common things is rituals are known for their formality and invariance, in the sense that the performance occurs at the same date and time and contains particular elements that are always the same. And you might have been at a small ceremony, for example, where somebody, sometimes from the audience, might just say at the end, "Oh, you forgot to read the ode," or "You forgot to say this," or something like, "Oh, yes." So then they'll fit that back in. So it's important that none of the steps are left out at these ceremonies. And it's not just the officials who are performing the ritual, the set core part of the ceremony, but the audience knows as well, and that's the nature of a ritual. Rituals often involve very simple acts, and also that there's no need to explain what it is that people are doing. And a couple of times I've asked people why they chose to lay a poppy at a different place, and they will sort of say to me, "Well, of course that's what you do. We did that because that was the most obvious thing to do." Catherine Bell, who analysed ritual, shows that it's the performance of actually conducting the ritual that gives it a special or privileged status, something that's sacred, and it's not something that's possible at another time or at another place. It's thought that the practice then of formality and invariance, together with the sense of specialness, acts to create agreement about the ceremony and its meaning, and partly for the reason that it's actually difficult to interrupt and introduce another meaning into that kind of situation. I've looked at there's evidence of a strong linguistic ritual in the cemetery visitor books, and where people write, most of the comments are written in very short but almost word for word phrases, and you could guess what they write. They write "Rest in peace," "Lest we forget," a lot of Australians write that, "Always remembered," "Never forgotten," "Thanks," and "God bless." So the elements of memory are here, and these are remembering and not forgetting, and remembering forever across generations. So Catherine Bell also argues that, and she writes that the power of performance lies in great part in the effect of the heightened multi-sensory experience it affords. One is not being told or shown something so much as one is being led to experience something. So ritual uses the senses to communicate its messages and this idea of specialness. So things like the dress of the formal performers, the music and the setting are all important. And people are commonly moved by a simple thing like playing the last post, or by pipers playing the flowers at the forest, say at a memorial. And they might be impressed by the military uniforms and the flags as well. But John Stevens wrote that memory is also evoked through the bodily experience of the ceremony and its formal rituals, which is shared with others. The sharing is important. And another important thing to remember about the involvement of the audience in a ritual. And Catherine Bell writes, it would be wrong to conclude that most people do not know why they are involved in a ritual situation. And indeed, it is more common in most communities to need a good reason not to participate in ritual activities. Finally, I have spoken to somebody who had kind of an alienated experience. So this person attended a very formal, large commemorative ceremony. They had gone to quite a lot of effort beforehand to bring some objects to that ceremony, but because they were from only a country that had had a small involvement in the Great War, they were virtually excluded from the ceremony. I don't think it was intentional on the part of the organisers. I think it was perhaps the effect of a country with a big involvement in this particular battle compared to a country with a smaller involvement. But the thing is, there are lots of countries with smaller involvement. But the person's experience was, it was not anger, it was really disappointment. And I really felt for this person that they had gone to so much effort and were then disappointed in the end. So I found this is a very difficult thing for me as a researcher to analyse and report, because I don't want to identify the person at all, but I suspect that there are other people in a similar position who may be disappointed in some way, and that there are moves to include lots of people, but perhaps it's not quite as easy as we think it might be. Finally, I think a lot of experience is unspoken. I think it's felt, but it's difficult to articulate a lot of the experiences that people might have. It's also difficult to research them. I find I have a problem with speaking to people about these issues in public. You just can't do that. It's not something I'm comfortable with at all. So for me, the point of the research and the remembrance is to remember those men and women who lived and died through those terrible years that were created by the Great War. I think it's an important task that we all have.